I was 17 years old, standing in the Tillamook County Assessor's office on a Wednesday afternoon in April 2003, holding a crumpled envelope with a $7 money order inside. The man behind the counter, barrel-chested, reading glasses on a chain, name tag that said Gerald, looked at me the way adults look at a kid who just said something embarrassing. $7, he said. Yes, sir. He flipped open the folder on his desk. 18.4 acres, no road access, no utilities, annual flooding, March through June. Last 3 owners defaulted on taxes. He looked up. You're 17. Yes, sir. He looked back at the folder, then at me. Then he did something I didn't expect. He laughed, not unkind, just the way you laugh when something is so absurd it's actually funny. He stamped the deed transfer, took my envelope, and slid a single sheet of paper across the counter. It's yours, he said. Good luck with it. I folded that paper and put it in the back pocket of my jeans. Outside it was raining. It was always raining in Tillamook in April. I walked 2 blocks to where my grandmother's truck was parked and sat in the passenger seat. Well, she said. I held up the deed. She smiled, put the truck in reverse, and said only 4 words. Now we go look. My grandmother, Lena Marsh, had grown up in the Nehalem Valley during the Depression. She'd learned to read land the way other people learn to read faces. What it was hiding, what it wanted, what it would give you if you were patient enough to ask the right way. She never owned a credit card, never had a car payment. She kept her money in a tin box under the kitchen floorboard, and she kept her opinions to herself. What she did have was a leather-bound journal, one she'd been writing in since 1961, full of observations about land, water, geology, and something she called the patience of stone. When she handed it to me on my 16th birthday, she didn't say anything dramatic. She just said, read the parts about water first. I read the whole thing in 2 nights. The journal talked about mineral deposits, about how water doesn't carry gold randomly. It carries it methodically, drops it in specific places, buries it in specific layers. She'd mapped the old Nehalem watershed before the county rerouted it in 1978. She'd identified 4 sites she believed had undisturbed alluvial concentrations, places where the original creek bed bent sharply inland, slowed, and dropped whatever it was carrying. 3 of those sites were on land that had been developed or fenced off. The 4th was the parcel I just bought for $7. We parked the truck at the end of a gravel road and walked in from the north property line. The ground was waterlogged, covered in sedge grass and red alder. Twice I sank to my ankle and had to pull my boot free by hand. My grandmother walked ahead of me like she'd been here before. She stopped at a depression in the ground about 200 yards in, knelt down, pressed her palm flat against the earth. Here, she said. How do you know? She pointed to the way the vegetation changed, cattails to the west, willows to the east, and a thin line of wild iris running straight north to south across the depression like a seam. Water remembers where it used to go, she said. Plants know it before we do. We dug with hand shovels. 4 inches down, the soil changed from black clay to gray gravel, coarser, denser, mixed with smooth river stones the size of quarters. I scooped a handful into the mason jar I'd brought. Back at the truck, she produced a gold pan from behind the seat, like she'd had it there for years, because she had. We panned at the drainage ditch along the county road. It took her 3 passes. Then she tilted the pan toward me. At the bottom, 6 specks, yellow, heavy, sitting still while everything else had washed away. She looked at me, I looked at her. That's what I thought, she said, and dumped the water out. We drove home and I did the math. 6 specks from 1 handful. 1 handful from 1 spot at 1 depth. The parcel was 18.4 acres. The original creek bed, according to my grandmother's journal, ran in 3 separate channels across this land before the county drainage work buried them. At that moment, I had maybe $3 worth of gold in a mason jar, but I had 18 acres of the same geology, and I was 17 years old, and the county had just sold it to me for $7 because they thought it was worthless swamp. The kids from school who laughed when I said I was spending my summer looking at dirt, they were at the lake. Getting sunburned. Forgetting about it by August, I went back every weekend for 3 months. I kept a notebook the way my grandmother had taught me, grid coordinates, soil depth and color, whether the gravel was coarse or fine, where the stones were smooth, where they were angular. By July, I had a pattern. The gold wasn't spread across the whole parcel. It was concentrated in 2 bands, exactly where the old channel bends were, exactly where my grandmother had drawn red circles in her journal 40 years earlier. The rest of the land was just swamp. But those 2 bands were something else entirely. August 14th, a Tuesday. I remember the date because it was my mother's birthday, and I almost didn't go out. I was working a section I'd marked in the journal as Site 2C, a low ridge of packed gravel about 300 yards from the property line, running perpendicular to where the old channel would have been. I dug down 18 inches and hit a layer that was different from anything I'd found before. Darker, almost purple-gray. The gravel here was finer, packed tight, almost cemented together by sediment. I had to use the trowel like a chisel to break it free. I brought 2 buckets back to the sluice box I'd set up along the drainage ditch. When I cleaned the riffles that afternoon, I stopped counting at 30 specks. Some of them weren't specks. Some of them were the size of apple seeds. I sat back in the grass and just looked at the pan for a long time. I weighed what I had on the kitchen scale that night, 1.3 grams. Gold was around $360 an ounce at that time. I checked in the newspaper the way we did back then, $15 from one afternoon. From 2 buckets of mud, I called my grandmother. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "I found Site 2C. There was a pause. "How deep?" she said. 18 inches. Another pause. "Go back tomorrow," she said. "Go deeper." I went deeper. At 26 inches, the layer changed again. Fine black sand packed beneath the gravel. And in that black sand, concentrated like it had been poured there deliberately, flour gold. Fine as dust, dense as anything I'd ever seen. I didn't understand what I was looking at until I went back to the journal. My grandmother had been here before, not her specifically. But her father, my great-grandfather, William Marsh, had worked this exact stretch of land in the summers of 1938 and 1939. He'd recorded his findings in a notebook that my grandmother had copied, word for word, into her own journal when she was 19. I found the entry dated June 22nd, 1938. He'd written, "Site near the iron-stained ridge, black sand layer at 2 feet below surface. Rich, don't tell the county. Don't tell anyone. This is ours." I read that 3 times, then I flipped to the next page. There was a sketch, hand-drawn, a rough map of the property with notations in pencil. He'd marked 7 sites. I had found 2. There were 5 more. I started finding them in September, not just gold. My great-grandfather, it turned out, had done more than mine this land. He'd used it as a vault. The 3rd site I excavated, marked in his sketch as the fallen cedar east side, I hit something solid at 14 inches. Not rock, metal. I cleared it with my hands. A square tobacco tin, sealed with electrical tape that had gone brittle with age. I carried it to solid ground before I opened it. Inside, a folded cloth, and inside the cloth, 4 gold coins, American Eagles, 1928. I didn't know what they were worth. I knew they were worth more than whatever I'd expected to find. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the tin open in front of me, my great-grandfather's journal sketch laid out flat beside it. I counted the remaining sites. 5 left. I thought about a man I'd never met, working alone in a swamp in the middle of the Depression, hiding coins in the ground instead of putting them in a bank. I thought about what it meant that he'd drawn that map, that he'd written that journal, that my grandmother had copied every word of it, that she'd handed it to me on my birthday and told me to read the water pages first. I asked her about it on a Sunday in October. We were sitting at her kitchen table. She'd made coffee. She always made coffee. "Did you know the coins were there?" I said. She wrapped both hands around her mug, didn't answer right away. "I suspected," she said finally. "Why didn't you just go yourself?" She looked out the window at the filbert orchard she'd tended for 30 years. "Because I was waiting for someone who'd actually stay," she said. "Someone who'd work it right, someone patient enough." She turned to look at me. "My father wrote that map for whoever was willing to earn it. I didn't think it should be just anyone." She went back to looking at the orchard. "I wasn't sure it was you until you spent your birthday money on that parcel. I didn't say anything for a while." "What did he pull out of there?" I said. She smiled. "Very small. Enough to keep this farm through the Depression, through the war, and through 2 years when there wasn't a single crop worth selling." She set down her mug. "He never told anyone. Not the bank, not the county." She looked at me. "And neither should you. Not yet." I found the remaining 5 sites between October and the following March. Each one was different. Site 4 was buried under the root mass of a Douglas fir that had fallen sometime in the 1960s. 2 mason jars sealed with paraffin wax. Inside, rolled coins, Walking Liberty $half from the 1930s and 40s, packed 20 to a roll. Site 5 was in the clay bank along the north edge of the property, wrapped in oilcloth and set into a carved pocket in the bank wall like a shelf. A leather pouch with pre-1933 gold coins, a dozen of them. Site 6 was the one that took me the longest to find. The deep channel site my great-grandfather had marked with a double circle, his notation for something significant. I spent 3 weekends digging in the wrong spot before I found the subtle change in soil color that marked the actual location. What was there was not a tin or a jar. It was a cast-iron box with a hasp latch, rusted nearly shut. I pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside, wrapped in canvas, 41 pieces of gold, mostly nuggets, ranging from pea-sized to thumb-sized. A few larger, all of them from this land, pulled out of this swamp, 1 piece at a time, by a man who lived through the worst economic collapse in American history and decided the only bank he trusted was the ground itself. I sat in the mud with that box in my lap until the light went flat. Then I carried it home. I didn't take any of it to a dealer that year. Or the next year, I called my grandmother first. I told her what I'd found across all 6 remaining sites. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Add it to what you already have. When you know what you want to do with the land, then you decide." I graduated high school that spring. Everyone else was talking about college, leaving, getting out. I was thinking about the parcel, about the 2 gold-bearing bands I'd mapped, about whether there was more below what I'd found, or whether my great-grandfather had worked the richest pockets and left the rest deliberately. I enrolled in a geology course at the community college in Tillamook. I started reading about alluvial deposits, about how creek diversions affect sediment concentration. I went back to the county records office and pulled every survey map of the original Nehalem watershed I could find. The diversion in 1978 hadn't just moved the water, it had sealed everything underneath. The old channels were preserved exactly as they'd been. No erosion, no disruption, no surface disturbance in 25 years. What my great-grandfather had worked was the exposed portion of those channels, the part he could reach. The sealed portion was still intact, untouched. Deeper than he'd been able to go with hand tools in 1939, I filed a mining claim at 19 years old. The day I filed the claim, I drove past the high school on my way back through town. Football practice was letting out. A group of guys I knew were piling into someone's truck in the parking lot. One of them saw me and hollered out the window, "Hey Marsh, still playing in the swamp?" I waved. Kept driving. That was 20 years ago. The parcel is still mine. I still work it some springs, when the conditions are right. My grandmother passed in 2011. I kept her journal. I added to it. I've added about 80 pages since she gave it to me, the way she added pages from her father. The total I've recovered over the years, gold, coins, minerals. I've never told anyone the exact number. What I will say is this. The farm my grandmother spent her whole life tending and worrying about and trying to hold on to through drought years and equipment failures and a timber economy that slowly died, that farm is paid off. Has been for a long time. No mortgage, no loan, no debt. And it happened because a man I never met didn't trust banks. Because a woman I loved more than anyone decided to wait for the right person. Because a 17-year-old kid spent $7 on land that made everyone else laugh. My great-grandfather wrote in his journal, in the summer of 1939, "The ground doesn't give to the loudest person. It gives to the one who shows up, stays quiet, and pays attention." I've been paying attention ever since. If you grew up being told you were wrong about something, about a place, a plan, a piece of land that everyone else dismissed, I want to hear about it. If you've ever done the quiet work while other people were busy being loud about easier things, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Drop your story in the comments. And if this one meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone patient, someone who waited, someone who believed in something nobody else could see, share it. There's someone in your life who needs to hear it.